When I was looking at the economy 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I'd kind of start with what are central banks doing and what are governments doing with their fiscal policy? What are exchange rates and currencies doing? And then kind of think about how that's going to affect the performance of economies and financial markets. Whereas now the geopolitics is really the first thing we think about. And again, I think what it's doing is really adding to that volatility.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past, present, and emerging. Today's episode is on the transition to renewable energy from the lens of an economist. There are numerous stats about the trillions of dollars that will be poured into green investments in the next few decades, and that translates to jobs growth, better energy sources, and the big one, energy security. But low emissions and sustainable technology needs backing from across all sectors, and therein lies the challenge. And we also want to explore what are the impact economically to the country and to all the investors from retail to the institutional community. Joining us to unpack all of this is Brian Redican, Chief Economist at TCorp. TCorp is the financial services partner to the New South Wales public sector, providing investment management and advice. With $117 billion of assets under management, TCorp is a top 10 Australian institutional investor and is the central borrowing authority of the state of New South Wales with a balance sheet of more than $190 billion. So Brian is the chief economist at TCorp, and prior to that, he also headed up the Australian and New Zealand economic research at Macquarie Bank and worked at the Reserve Bank of Australia, where he was responsible for compiling economic activity forecasts. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So Financial Standard Sustainability readers had the opportunity to see you present your 2025 economics outlook at the Chief Economist Forum held early this year. In that forum, you touched on energy transition, which I thought would be worth expanding on through this podcast. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the topic, let's start first with the work you do at TCorp and provide a bit of context on how there's like this cross-section between the sustainability investing world and also the government, and then just your kind of discussion around the economy nationally and globally.
So TCorp does manage the financial assets for the New South Wales government and its individual businesses. And really, it's the New South Wales government that sets the investment aims and goals. And then we just have to get the best returns in the most efficient way at the lowest cost. So that's really our focus there.
And so with that in mind, you have your stewardship team, and you of course, as a chief economist, would provide the insights and expertise on all things from inflation and monetary policy and everything in between. So let's kick off with that. So what are the implications of, let's say, volatile energy prices, which is happening right now, to inflation and monetary policy?
So I think that's a really important one, because when you kind of step back and think about how important energy is for all sectors of the economy, it really is fundamental in that sense. I kind of think about food price inflation, for example, and the link between oil prices and food prices is not directly apparent when you first think about it. But you think about all the major costs for farmers, whether it be fertilizer or diesel running the tractors, that's also very closely tied to oil prices. And then, of course, getting the food from the farms to the supermarkets, again, oil is a major part of that cost chain there. So when we do see spikes in oil prices, it's not just the petrol at the service station that goes up, it's a broad increase in prices right throughout the economy there. So that's really why we think it's really important to focus on not just the level of energy prices, but the volatility of energy prices as well.
And in terms of your outlook for the next 2 to 3 years, I know that at the Chief Economist Forum, we talked about geopolitical risk. What is the latest thinking right now?
So I suppose geopolitics has really got to the top of the agenda. When I was looking at the economy 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I'd kind of start with what are central banks doing and what are governments doing with their fiscal policy? What are exchange rates and currencies doing? And then kind of think about how that's going to affect the performance of economies and financial markets. Whereas now the geopolitics is really the first thing we think about. And again, I think what it's doing is really adding to that volatility. So obviously, over the last decade or so, there has been a broad push towards thinking about the transition to net zero by 2050. And that's affected financial institutions, it's affected investors and governments. And now really we've seen with the inauguration of President Trump, a real question mark over that agenda. And it has created a lot of uncertainty for investors, for financial institutions about what the next stages are. And again, I think the sort of takeout for us is that what it implies is that energy prices are probably going to be much more volatile in the period ahead. And I suppose we've had a bit of an experience of that when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we saw those huge surges in gas prices, in coal prices, and ultimately electricity prices as well.
My goodness, any more volatility? Every time I pass by the petrol station, as you've said, that's probably the most basic way that people understand volatility in energy prices. But yes, definitely in the sustainable investment community right now, they are really feeling the uncertainty. And in fact, there's a little bit of green hushing, if you like, where people don't even want to talk about the fact that they're doing their pro-sustainable investing. So with that in mind, what would be the demand for sustainable investments in the short to medium term?
I suppose one way to think about it is, are we still going to transition towards net zero, or has that actually just stopped in its tracks? And I think a major part of the problem for companies and for investors at the moment is that we still don't have any degree of clarity about the way that policies will be positioned in 3 or 4 years' time. And you can't make these very long-term investments without having that degree of clarity there. So, President Trump's talking about drill, baby, drill. But really, even if you're inclined to invest in oil production, will you have the confidence to do that, knowing that in 4 years' time or 5 years' time, the background situation might be very different there? And so what we need to see is more investment in the energy space. It could be renewable energy, it could be nuclear power, or it could be the fossil fuels that we've had over the last 100 years. But we do need that investment to take place. And I think what that uncertainty does is it delays that investment. And so we're becoming increasingly reliant on smaller and smaller production. And so if there is any disruption in wind power or nuclear power, again, as we saw in Europe back in 2022, then suddenly there's a mad rush to the marginal producers of gas, for example, or coal. And that's where you get the big surges in prices there. But again, if you're thinking about energy security and sustainability, do you want to remain beholden to very fluctuating fossil fuel prices? Or if you can actually transition away to domestically sourced energy, then again, it's going to be a costly process, but in the long term, you might have that stable energy prices, and that would provide you with a great competitive advantage.
Yes, you've mentioned the big word there, which is the cost. Hence, there are a lot of delays in investing, building more infrastructure around renewable energy. So the reality of it at the moment is that 40% of global shipping transports use fossil fuel. And so what does this mean for sustainable investors? You've mentioned looking at alternative energy sources, but truly it still seems to be the dominant source of energy.
Absolutely. And it's taken 150 years to build that infrastructure around what was the most available, convenient supply of energy there. And so again, that's one of the challenges that we have at the moment, trying to undo that infrastructure and create an alternative. And so that's obviously a very kind of challenging process there. But again, I think it's delays that really exacerbate the cost, where if we can do it progressively over time, again, it will take time, but that's probably the most feasible way of achieving that transition.
Now, besides fossil fuel or renewable energy sources, are there any other key considerations for investors right now? I know at the forum you've talked about the availability of raw materials, for example, and then the interest rates as well, and the cost of running a business.
Yeah, so again, I think the experience of the last couple of years has really shown the interplay of geopolitics, so Russia invading Ukraine, the impact of being reliant, so Europe was reliant on Russian gas, and that didn't prove to be sustainable at all for Europe there. And that's created massive consequences, particularly for the German economy, because that was very, very dependent on that cheap Russian gas. So now German companies have become much less competitive, and the German economy basically hasn't grown in the last 5 years. So again, that's kind of something that we hadn't seen before, but now has become more present there. But I think the other thing that we need to think about is, the risk of assets that become very worthless very quickly. And again, I think that's one of the risks with the transition to net zero. And again, the sort of geopolitics that we're talking about there.
Now, it's probably hard to kind of unpack everything in just the one podcast. But just to recap, I understand that there really truly is a conflict between trying to invest long-term in energy sources that really amplify energy security versus the needs today and the market uncertainty, the geopolitical uncertainty. But my last question now is a little bit more personal. With super funds, there have been the rise of what's called socially aware options, sustainable investment options, and a lot of fund members, future retirees, have hundreds of thousands of dollars in these options. What do you think are the key considerations for them to think about in terms of the economy, the market uncertainty, given that truly this is their retirement savings at stake?
So again, I think pension funds, superannuation funds in Australia, they really do have to be driven by their clients, their customers there, and provide them with the array of investment options that will satisfy their needs. So some people are obviously just focused on what the end return will be, regardless of whether it's invested. Whereas for other people, it's really important that their funds are being used for good things rather than bad things. Investing in tobacco or, armaments, defense goods,
gambling.
That kind of stuff. Exactly. So that choice, I think, is really important there. But once the members have made that choice, then it is really beholden on the investors to ensure that they get delivered what they say on the packet. And again, within that scope, they achieve the best returns that's possible there.
Thank you. So, Brian, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.